much. So yes, my name is Marieke Vandeweyer, and I lead the work on vocational education and training in the Center for Skills from the OECD in Paris. And I will quickly take you through some of our key findings in terms of the future of vocational education, with a focus on continuing vocational education, and then also show you some of the outputs that we have. Now, I don't think I need to repeat all of the things that are already said on the mega trends on COVID and how there's changing skill needs. I think we're all convinced, we all know that skill needs are changing and that we should take action. Just to bring in some of the figures of the work that we have done. So we estimate that 14% of jobs could be fully automated in the coming decades, and that in addition, 32% of jobs could significantly change. So they won't disappear, but the people who are working in those jobs will see changes in the tasks that they are doing. Then, of course, something we often forget is that automation also creates lots of jobs. In fact, what we also know is that the jobs that are being created are quite different than the jobs that are disappearing. And if you look at the data as well, in the past 2 decades, we've seen a massive increase in high-skilled jobs. And already today, around 50% of workers are in what we would call digitally intensive sectors. At the same time, our data at the OECD also show that many adults do not have strong digital skills. There's still many who have no computer experience or that lack really the basic digital skills. There's certainly a mismatch in that area. Now, since we know that skill needs are changing, we also know that we need to invest in training. But if you look at our data from the OECD survey of adult skills, we also see that not all adults participate in training, and that there are also big differences between countries. So across the OECD, on average, we know that around 47% of adults participate in training in a given year. Now, is all types of training. This drops to around 41%, if I'm not mistaken, if you only look at training that is work-related, so for your current job or to get a new job. Now, what we see also here is that most of the training happens in non-formal training, so outside of the formal education system. So there's only a relatively small share of adults who participate in formal vocational education or in formal higher education. In fact, if you look at our data from our Education at a Glance publications, a new one is coming out today, by the way. There we see as well, if you look at the formal education system, in many countries, there are very few adults who participate in vocational education and training in the formal system. Now, in terms of the country differences, that's very clear, I think, from this chart. So you have a few countries where there's more than 60% of adults participating in training in a certain year. But then there's also, on the other end of the spectrum, various countries, and we don't have them all here, but just in terms of OECD countries, we see Turkey, but then there's also Russia, Kazakhstan, for which we have the data, where there's only around 20% of adults who participate in training. So certainly more efforts are needed to bring in more adults into training. Now, another finding from these data is that there's very big differences in terms of the people who participate in training. So very big gaps between different types of adults, different types of workers. In this chart, for example, you see this is again the share of adults participating in formal or non-formal training in a given year. What we see is that low-skilled adults participate much less than higher-skilled ones. Older adults also participate less. Quite interestingly is also that adults who are in jobs that have a high risk of being automated participate less in training than those who are in, let's say, jobs that are a bit safer in terms of automation. Also, those who are in non-standard jobs, so not permanent, not full-time, they participate less in training. What is not shown in this chart is the difference between workers by firm size. And I have this in a separate chart here. So this is again the share of workers who participate in training, but this time by firm size. So very interesting is that in all OECD countries that we have, for which we have the data, workers, the smaller the firm size, the less likely that the worker will participate in training. And across the OECD on average, there's quite a big gap. So if you look at micro-sized firms, you have only around 40% of workers participating in training, whereas in the large firms, it's around 65%. A substantial gap, and you see in some countries that gap is even much bigger, which is the case in Chile, for example, Korea, Turkey. But again, I think it's quite clear that in all the countries, you have that relatively big difference between firm size. And I think it's not surprising as well if you look at the barriers to training that adults face. Now, this chart shows the reasons why someone did not participate in training, even though they wanted to. I have to make it also very clear in our data, we see that the main reason that first people do not participate in training is that they don't want to. They don't think they need to. They have no interest in training. That's the main reason. Now, among those that did want to participate, but they couldn't, or in the end they didn't manage, the main reason is that they don't have time to participate in training. So they don't have time because of work. That's the case for 28% of the adults. They don't have time for family reasons. That's for 15% of adults the case. Financial constraints are also substantial for some adults, 16% of adults. But clearly the shortage of time is really an obstacle. And I think that also explains partially why SME workers participate less in training. When they are working and they need to take time off of work, this causes quite a big problem in SMEs because, of course, there are fewer options to replace those workers. So that shortage of time because of work reasons, that could be really a problem for SME workers. So these are just a few of the key data points that we have on participation by adults in training. Now, looking towards the future, we have a lot of work ongoing, both on the formal vocational education system and on non-formal training. And we have here a couple of pointers for continuing that. Now, let it also be clear that all of these recommendations also apply to initial vocational education training, which remains obviously a very important part of the education system and which should ensure that people enter the labor market with the right skills. We're focusing on the continuing part of VET. So what is first of all important is to invest in responsive VET systems to make sure that they invest in the right skills, that people can develop the right skills. This can be done, for example, by making better use of data, skills intelligence, as we usually refer it, but also to work closer with the social partners. I think that was also clear from the discussion just now, how important that is to really work between the VET providers and the employers and the trade unions. The second aspect is to make VET more flexible and therefore also more inclusive. I mean, one of the barriers is indeed time-related constraints. So making VET flexible in terms of, for example, modular provision, part-time provision, recognition of prior learning as well, online learning as we have experienced in the past year, that will really help adults to be able to participate in a more flexible way. The inclusiveness element, of course, as I was mentioning for SMEs as well, that also involves giving targeted support to those who need it. So in the case of SME workers or to SMEs in general, really targeting, for example, financial support towards those SMEs who are struggling. That could also involve providing support when a worker is off for training, is on training leave, for example, finding some support for a replacement worker. The third aspect is to support transitions. We know that people do not stay in the same job for their whole career, or even if they stay in the same job, that job will be changing. So what is important here is that adults have good transversal skills. That means soft skills, to be adaptable, to be able to learn, for example, but also involves foundational skills. There's still many adults who have weak basic skills like literacy and numeracy, and really to help them navigate a changing labor market, those basic skills need to be strengthened. Another aspect here of transitions is to provide good career guidance. There's so many training options out there. There's so many support measures from the governments, for example, but adults need to know about them and need to be able to navigate that market. So career guidance can be an effective tool in that area. And lastly, innovation. We also heard it just now that training needs to be made fun, and that can also, technology could help there. For example, think of innovations in terms of virtual and augmented reality. We should see how we can make better use of that in vocational education and training, but also in terms of new pedagogical approaches that work better for adults. So innovation can make things better in terms of quality, but also more attractive for adult learners. But just to end, because I know we're a bit short on time, what are we doing in this area? We do a lot of work on formal vocational education and training. We have a whole new project on the future of vets coming out next year, as well as a project on professional tertiary education and the pathways between vets and those higher level programs. We published recently research on the implications of the COVID pandemic on vocational education and training. We have some research on teachers, on apprenticeships. And then on the non-formal side, likewise, we have reports on the quality of that type of training, the future readiness of training. And we have a lot of work ongoing on career guidance. So there's all these types of thematic reports that we publish. But then we also support countries. So we do a lot of country reviews where we really help the countries in the different aspects of their vet system to see how to make them stronger, how to make them more resilient by providing very tailored recommendations to the countries. One aspect I think where the OECD is quite well known for is also the data side. So we do quite a lot of work on developing better indicators on adult learning. So we have, which you see here in this small image, dashboard on priorities for adult learning, where you can see for all OECD countries where they are in terms of their effectiveness or the participation in adult learning. In addition to that, we have our Education at a Glance report that came out today. I do encourage you to take a look. It has a lot of data on the formal vocational education training system in terms of enrollment, work-based learning, labor market outcomes. So that we update every year as well. And then lastly, we organize lots of events also to discuss with experts how the vet system should evolve. And we have, for example, with our colleagues from CITIFOP, towards the end of October, a webinar on apprenticeships for greener economies and societies. So I take the opportunity to promote that event here. You can already register on our websites. So all of our work is freely accessible and downloadable on the OECD website. So I do encourage you to take a look, and please feel free to reach out if you would struggle to find any of these resources. Thank you.